Okay, let's get started. Thank you, everyone. Today's session is about the role of finance in sustainability programs. The idea today, as we all know, sustainability is a very important issue from an ESG perspective, environmental, social, and governance. And we wanted to have three great speakers and presenters who can give us three vantage points. We'll have Bob Hirth, who comes from the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. I've known Bob for quite a long time. We also have Jamie Horst from Traditional Medicinal, who has a very strong background in finance and ESG type programs. And Joseph Button comes to us from Strauss Family Creamery, who is also a practitioner in sustainability. Before we get started, we have a couple of housekeeping items that we want to address. Number one, we hope that everyone can put their mute button on. Number two, if you have any questions, post your questions in the chat room. We'll have Kelsey Taylor and Carolyn Stark to help read those as we get to the Q&A area. We also want to let you know that we are recording this session in case someone wants to share it with another colleague, and which we highly emphasize that you do that because we think we'll have a good, fun session today. So with that in mind, let's get started. Bob Hirth, he'll introduce himself. I will put myself on mute and let's get started. Bob, I'll turn it over to you, sir.
Great, thank you, Mark, and hello, everybody. And Carolyn, if you put our first slide up there. So my name is Bob Hirth. I'm a senior managing director at a consulting firm called Protiviti, and I happen to be the co-vice chair at the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, known fondly as the SASB. Let me give you a little large public company perspective as to what's going on. So think about organizations like Wells Fargo, Accenture, Levi, Safeway, Visa, General Motors, Apple, HP, the big mega corporations. For all of you, especially in the finance area, the financial statements have served for decades as the main information source for investors and other users. But what I want to tell you now is that that's not enough. There are more people, wanting more information, and they want to know how you use natural resources, how you impact the environment, how much water do you use, how you treat your employees, how you treat your suppliers, might you have child labor in your supply chain, and how do you govern and manage, especially related to the diversity of your workforce, your management, and your board. So that's the key takeaway on this slide. Next slide, Carolyn, please. So the big picture of all of that is how do you create some coherent, standardized, comparative system of all of this, I'll call other reporting or other accounting. It's not double entry bookkeeping, but it is a form of accounting. And how do you take that concept that we have for US GAAP and IFRS and now begin to develop something around ESG so investors can make these comparisons as they evaluate and value organizations. Next slide, Carolyn. There are a number of benefits that many studies have shown come with being focused on ESG factors. As you can see here, companies that are leaders in these areas and thinking about that generally enjoy a lower cost of capital in terms of borrowing rate. There's studies that show their operational performance and their earnings, thus their valuations are higher. So there's a lot of input here that's saying doing more good makes you a better company. Next slide, Carolyn. And 18 months is not a long-term, period. But if you look at the well-known S&P 500 index, and then look to what S&P has created in terms of what I'll call a cherry-picked index called the S&P 500 ESG index, you can see since the beginning of that mutual fund that there's been an outperformance of those cherry-picked, higher performing, better reporting on ESG matter companies than the overall 500 companies in that index. Next slide, Carolyn. So if you look at those largest 500 companies, the largest 500 companies by market cap on US stock exchanges, you can see over time, more and more of the companies have reported in some way related to ESG and sustainability. So at least as of 2019, we're at about 450 of those 500 companies reporting something they call a sustainability report, corporate social responsibility, or or ESG. The group that does this is an organization called the G&A Institute, and their 2020 report should be out in the next month. And it's not only going to just cover the S&P 500, but it will actually cover the Russell 1000. Next slide. So the good news is we have 450 companies reporting something, but pick your GAAP or pick your IFRS or pick your poison or pick your methods, whatever you want to call it. So you can see here within those 450 companies, you see some choosing to use something called the Global Reporting Initiative, some starting out with something called the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, about a quarter of back then using SASB and so on. And also interestingly, about a third of those companies have some form of external assurance, in many cases limited to the greenhouse gas emissions. And that assurance in many cases is provided by an engineering firm. So lots of reporting. Problem is it's all different. Next slide. This, what we call this alphabet soup of organizations, has voluntarily agreed and publicly stated, they're trying to converge. They're looking at each of their different standards and frameworks to see where they're similar, where they're different. One notable example of that is the Integrated Reporting Council and the SASB have recently agreed to merge, and that merge will be physically completed within about the next 60 days or so. So for those of you that are not familiar with all the acronyms and alphabet soup, you might make a little note to take a look at what each of those are. Next slide, please. Also, now what's happened is, in addition to those organizations, the IFRS Foundation has weighed in. They've issued a consultation paper for which now they've received almost 600 comment letters. Their consultation paper says there is no question at all that there's a demand for this information related to environmental, social, and governance information for companies. The question that IFRS is trying to answer is, what should the role of the IFRS Foundation be? As you know, they've converged over time all of the country GAAP that used to exist into one singular set of financial reporting standards, and 144 jurisdictions voluntarily have adopted those standards. So the notion would be, here's an organization that has some street credibility around pulling all this together, and that the idea over the long term is those ESG reporting standards that we want to be global and coherent would be orchestrated by this organization. Next slide. And to confuse you a little bit more with all of this stuff that's out there, the World Economic Forum, working a little bit uniquely, I'd say, with all of the big four firms who collaboratively authored a document called Managing Stakeholder Capitalism. It takes that alphabet soup of standards. So it takes SASB and GRI and TCFD, and like the S&P 500 ESG index, cherry picks from among those and comes up with some 21 particular standards that they might suggest create a framework for ESG reporting. So you can find that over at the World Economic Forum website. Next slide. So if you think about many of the institutional investors, and the largest institutional investor in the world, which is now almost $9 trillion of assets under management, Mr. Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, has continued to issue his annual letters. His letter issued in January of 2020, I think, was really a shot across the bow. So right off the bat, in the first paragraph, it says, we're going to vote against management. We're going to vote against the board. We're going to vote you out if we believe you subjectively are not making sufficient progress around the sustainability disclosures and the activities and plans that underlie those. And very simply, we'd like you to report two things. We'd like you to report the industry-specific SASB standards, and we'd like you to report the climate-related matters on a framework called TCFD, or the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosures. Next slide, please, Carolyn. You can look this up at TCFD, but the TCFD framework is a climate-only framework, started out in the UK. So that's what Larry Fink is talking about. It's not all that difficult, but when you begin to look at the quantification of that, it gets to be a little bit thorny. Next slide. And his other point is around the industry-specific SASB guidelines. SASB has divided the world into 11 sectors, 77 industries, as you see here. If you go to the SASB website, you can put a ticker symbol in under the standard section. It will show you how you map to that, those sectors and industries, and then we'll show you the actual, I'll call suggested voluntary standards that SASB has developed. Next slide, please. You know, just reporting things like revenue, as you know, you have to have more detailed. So SASB, in addition to their summary of standards, has a series of technical protocols. So it explains what is the item to be reported, how do you calculate it, what is the information you use, what are the you know, the measurements that you use, is it in pounds, is it in whatever. So again, all that's available at sasb.org. Next slide. And this is just an example of how the standards get summarized. So you can see here for a particular industry, it shows some qualitative and quantitative items that need to be reported. And then underlying that would be the technical protocol for each of those items that describes in more detail how you would actually compute that. And again, that's all available at sasb.org. Next slide, please. So one way to help narrow the field on this is something called SASB's materiality map. So on the left-hand side, it takes these big capital areas and what we call the general issue categories for each of those, and then starts to go across the industries and sectors and checkerboards those items that from our discussions with investors are deemed to be likely to be material. So the whole view of SASB is not all ESG matters pertain to all industries and all business models. And so that's why we have this bottom-up industry-specific methodology to develop the suggested standards for each of those sectors and industries. Next slide, Carolyn. So SASB has a public agenda, much like the FASB. You can find it on the website. These are the items that we're working on right now. We have a public disclosure, a 90-day public exposure process, and comments are always welcome. You can see all the comments made on any of these to date. Next slide, please. You know, with all of this, it goes without saying, but let's say it is, if you're going to report all this, there needs to be some form of effective internal control over that information. In addition to the roles I described to all of you, I was the chairman of COSO for 4.5 years. So I'm a big believer that the COSO internal control framework would really help address effective internal control over sustainability related and ESG related information. Next slide. There are conventions and standards for issuing third-party assurance reports by all of the accounting firms and, as I mentioned, engineering firms, especially when it comes to greenhouse gas information. So these are several organizations that have already issued those reports, and you might find those interesting. And this is a very growing area. Again, with IFRS involved in all of this convergence, there is a nirvana view that at the end of the day, this reporting would be subject to third-party assurance, just like the financial reporting information that we have third-party assured today. Next slide. You know, for those of you that are going to sleep because you're a private company, don't go to sleep. You have ESG issues. You use natural resources. You have suppliers. You have people. You try to attract them, retain them. And I think the biggest point for you to think about is where you have a company that's a public company as a customer, you may find that they're asking you for some ESG information, maybe asking you to change your packaging, et cetera. You might be surprised when you renew your next loan or go for some long-term financing. There are ESG related questions, and don't be surprised if your next property and casualty insurance renewal asks about some of those issues. So I think there are a number of issues that apply to private companies as well. Next slide. I think there's a number of things that each of you can look at, whether you're in public, in a public company or private. Just how do you get the dialogue started? How do you pull the team together? You know, what do you report? How do you report? And how do you make sure it's accurate? And then Carolyn, just to wrap up here, this is not about a cost. This is about being a better company. If you focus on this, you'll attract and retain people better. You'll be an organization that more people want to be a part of, that support, that they seek out, that they want to buy from you. So I'd really like you to think about this, and regardless of whether you're public or private, in my view, it truly deserves your attention. So Mark, with that, I'm all done.
Thanks, Bob. That was excellent. Let me turn over to Jamie, get another point of view. Jamie, you're on. All right.
Great. And Carolyn, I have some slides as well. Bob, that was so encouraging. I've been such a fan of SASB for so many years. So good to see really strong updates coming through. I was scared during the last administration. I'm also really encouraged to see that BlackRock is continuing to grow teeth. Every year, it seems like Larry's Lair has gotten more and more aggressive, and it seems like they are finally taking action and not just issuing warnings. So that's good. I labeled this presentation Purpose and Partnership. I'll say purpose instead of ESG, corporate responsibility, corporate citizenship, all of those things. Sustainability, to me, they're kind of coming under the umbrella. At Traditional Medicinals, our purpose is to support people, planet, and plants. And so sustainability and purpose are integrally related. I also wanted to talk about this as a practitioner at a privately held company. So when I say partnership, this is really how we're partnering with our executive team and helping them to understand how to implement these programs systemically across the organization, and specifically how to partner with our finance peers. If you go to the next slide, I'm not going to spend any time on this other than to say, I spent the first 9 years of my career in finance and supply chain, and the most recent 9 years in this philanthropy, corporate responsibility, sustainability space, mostly at private or at large public companies. For the last 2+ years, I've been at Traditional Medicinals. The next slide is about TM. Traditional Medicinals is largely a tea company, although we are moving into new product forms. And we've been a social business since before that was actually a phrase. Next slide. These are our founders. We were actually founded in 1974 in Sonoma County in the herbal sector. So you can imagine that kind of purpose and social business was really embedded into our DNA from the beginning. We were founded by a community organizer and an herbalist who were both really close to the land. And within the first year of running the company, they went down to visit one of their suppliers in Guatemala and realized that many of the folks working in those fields were very impoverished. And Drake actually came back to Northern California and spoke to his mentor in the community organizing movement and said, gosh, I don't know, this business looks like it's got some opportunity for taking off, but I don't know that I can build my success on this, knowing that the supply chain has real inherent challenges. And his mentor basically said, have I taught you nothing? Go fix it. And so that's what we've been attempting to do since the beginning. The next slide is just a few of our highlights from our 2020 sustainability report. Measurement is really important. I have lots of thoughts about ROI, as Mark was teasing me in the beginning, and how we measure this and the value that we bring. Probably won't have time to get into that today, but if any of you ever want to grab a coffee virtually and get more into the ROI on ESG, that's something that I love to nerd out on. The next slide, I wanted to talk through the value of certifications and frameworks from a practitioner standpoint. Bob mentioned that you might get engagement from some of your customers or suppliers, and that's really the way that things are going. I will say, you can flip to the next slide. Bob, I'm glad to see that there's some convergence happening. At the time that this slide was pulled together, there were actually many more organizations, and a lot of these are targeting that supply chain perspective. And I will say, as a practitioner, I've received inbound requests under many of these frameworks from our various customers, especially while with publicly traded companies. And it's a full-time job. You could spend all day, every day, just responding to those inbound requests. Next slide. However, while I think at one point I viewed them more as a task to be done to keep other large important stakeholders satisfied, I've really come to appreciate the value of these certifications and frameworks from an internal standpoint. What we have found at Traditional Medicinals is that, especially on the supply chain front, it's really important to us to have a sustainable supply chain. And by maintaining these certifications, we're not only able to really scale that impact and have confidence because of the third-party verification, it's also far cheaper than maintaining a team of 30 internal auditors who are constantly assessing any supply chain risks. So we view this as a very scalable, cost-effective way of ensuring integrity with our values. and frankly, mitigating risk through our supply chain. It's also a way of informing collective action. So the more we're able to sign on to these various certifications and frameworks, the more we're able to educate our consumers, and they in turn can start putting pressure on the other brands that they're allied with. The next slide is about B Corp. This is one that, as a privately traded company, or privately held company, this is something that we have really put a lot of emphasis on. We're both a B Corp and a benefit corporation. Those are sometimes confused, but the reason I wanted to call it out here was that I know we've got a mix of folks who are privately held companies and publicly traded companies. B Corp is administered by a nonprofit B Lab, and so it covers many aspects of social, environmental, and governance performance. Oh, nope, still on the prior slide. Thank you though for being on top of it. So this is one that I think it's really comprehensive. It requires recertification, verification every 3 years. You submit the assessment every year. This ranges from companies with 2 or 3 employees all the way up to companies like Danone with 105,000 employees. So this is something that if you are considering a standard, SASB is a great one, B Corp is another one that we really love. The benefit corporation is really about changing your bylaws and your legal structure. And so if you have lots of investors, that's probably harder to pull off. But this has been a really important one for us. As a practitioner, I will say frameworks help us think about the breadth of questions. When we became a B Corp, what we found was that because we've been engaging in our supply chain since the 70s, we had a firm basis of practice under us, but we didn't always have policies and procedures in place that informed that practice. We just knew it was the right thing to do, and so we did it, but we had the opportunity to close the gap on the paperwork piece. So whenever you sign on to any of these frameworks, you will inevitably identify some opportunities to make your program that much more robust. And as a practitioner, I think that's a real benefit. The other thing is that the bar keeps rising. Every single year, there are greater expectations from our investors and our employees and our customers. And so these standards and frameworks, because they also keep evolving, I think it's a really good way to keep your finger on the pulse of how expectations are changing. We were rated best for the world in 2019. They paused that honor in 2020, but we're hoping to be considered again in 2021 if that resumes. Okay, the next slide, just for those of you who are questioning from a finance standpoint, does this make sense? We've already said it's not really an option anymore, but the good news is these are just some of the data points. Bob shared some as well. When you focus on ESG and purpose, it just basically raises your game across the board. And so we do see that there is strong financial payback for taking those positions. Okay, next slide. Good, so now I wanted to talk a little bit about how we do this internally. Sustainability folks are sometimes different than finance-minded folks, and having spent 9 years in each of those sectors, I do feel qualified to empathize with both. We can go to the next slide and I'll talk a little bit about how we're doing this at TM. So many of you have heard of purpose-driven companies or triple bottom line. It's one of those things that's easy to say, and part of what I've been reflecting on as a practitioner is how do we partner with our finance organization to mirror their policies, their processes, their architecture, to make sure that we actually are delivering on this. We know that what gets measured gets managed. And so if we're really focused on managing to profitability and don't have equal rigor around how we're managing to purpose, I think it would be reasonable to question whether or not that's getting the attention that it deserves. And so what I've been looking at is, we all know the annual financial planning process. The finance team sends out their templates. The department leaders fill them out, sandbagging, they send it back. There's a bouncing back and forth that happens until everyone agrees that, yes, this is the plan for the year ahead. And then we check in monthly to see how we're tracking against that. And so this year we're implementing a similar process around purpose, where we're actually embedding it into our financial planning process to set goals by department to not only meet profitability goals, but also purpose goals. And I think it'll be really interesting. This is going to be a multi-year journey because I think in the past, we often thought about sustainability as something that a specific department did, as opposed to thinking about how are all of the resources that we steward within our department, even if it's IT or finance or operations, we don't always have the same degree of focus on how are we delivering on purpose. And we were working with a consultant recently, and they said people often ask us what percentage of revenue or profit should be applied to purpose. And they said the answer is, of course, 100%. And they went on to say, why would you align with business partners who hold vastly different and maybe subpar perspectives on your values? Why would you hire people who didn't align with your values and what you're trying to do? Why would you innovate products that aren't in alignment with your identity? So it's a different lens. It's a different way of looking at things to say, for the resources that are under my management, how can I steward them not only responsibly from a financial standpoint, but also in accordance with what we're trying to do in the world. And that's one of the benefits that being a benefit corporation and a B corporation gives us, is that we have the ability to manage toward stakeholder outcomes and not strictly marching toward this shareholder primacy view of the world. The next slide, there's always this question around goal setting when it comes to sustainability. There's the idea of the BHAG, you know, the big hairy goal, the 2050 goal, and by setting something truly aspirational, we'll have to innovate and work our way into that. I'm viewing that as this green arrow on the left around top-down performance. There's also the idea of bottom-up performance, and that's what I was really referencing in that last slide of asking each department leader to identify their goals for the year. And frankly, I think both are required. I think leadership does start at the top, culture starts at the top, and if you want to do something that is truly aspirational, it is going to require your executive team standing shoulder to shoulder and issuing mandates to say, this work will require all of us pulling in the same direction across department lines. It may be longer term than what we normally plan. It may be something that none of us feel like we have all the answers to do, but it's important for us, given our identity and our position within the industry, that we pull in this direction. I think that's necessary. I also think this bottoms up approach really allows every employee to have skin in the game. One of our board members recently said to me, I want the invitation to participate in purpose to be available to every employee. But my expectation is that every leader understands who we are and what we're trying to do and is pulling in that direction. And so to me, this is one of those opportunities where the department leaders can really paint a bigger picture. It's not just that we come in every day to earn a paycheck. It's not that we come in every day just to hit some operational target, but we're really trying to create positive change through this vehicle of social business. And what is our specific contribution to that overall goal? I think it really increases the meaning that people feel in their work. And maybe some of those department goals may not rise to our corporate balance scorecard, but my hope is that it's something that will be a rally cry for them, that in all of their staff meetings, they're elevating their own conversation and bringing new innovation and ideas and passion to the table because they know that they're contributing to something positive in the world directly, not just through funding a separate department who might get to have positive impact. Next slide. This is just acknowledging that when you're partnering between finance and sustainability, there are occasionally tensions. There are times where we want to use a new form of packaging that's more sustainable, but frankly might cost more, and it wasn't built into the initial cost projections. You can play that out across the board. Many, many points of tension. That's natural. It's not to be feared. But what I am curious about is how do we build governance structures that really help us mediate that well, so that we can understand if we're falling shy of our standards, of our true north, of our goals. Sometimes that happens. It's based on availability, it's based on speed to market, whatever it is. You may have to make those short-term decisions. And what is the agreement that we have in advance to keep revisiting those discussions so that we actually are able over time to close that gap and come closer to where we want to be? So I don't necessarily have an answer to this, but I do acknowledge it. And I think if we held it with a little bit more lightness, we wouldn't have to view it as so much conflict. We could simply say, this is what we're about. This is why we exist in the world and the positive change that we want to create. And these are the cost projections that we have right now. This is our cost basis. This is what's possible given how much availability there is of this product in the market. How do we move in the short term to meet our customer demand and not forget who we are and what we're trying to do? The last slide, I won't really spend any time on at all. It's simply saying your board should be involved with this as well. I think it really involves all levels of the organization. I talked about goal setting from an executive standpoint and department leader standpoint. I think that's really important. Aligning with your finance team around that is important, but we definitely have to take a stronger position on sustainability at the board level if we're going to see meaningful change in this world. That's a little bit of our practitioner perspective of how we're partnering at a privately held company with our finance team and using the architecture and the frameworks that already exist to keep driving the conversation forward. It's been an honor to speak with you, and I'm always happy to answer questions offline.
We have questions later, so get ready, Jamie.
Thanks.
But I'm going to turn it over to Joseph. Very well done, Jamie. Thank you. Joseph?
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, Bob, Jamie, excellent presentations. I hope everybody took a lot of notes. I know I did. Really top tier content on those subjects. Today, I'm going to dive into the weeds a bit and hopefully give all of you financiers out there just a little taste for how I think we can partner together to fund some really challenging and exciting sustainability initiatives that might pop up within your organization. I work for Strauss Family Creamery. For those of you who don't know, Strauss Family Creamery is a mission-based dairy company in Northern California. We exist to sustain the family farms that supply us with milk, and beyond that, be an advocate for rural farming communities everywhere. And I believe there should be some slides popping up that show our farmers who are really at the heart of what we do every day and why we strive to create top quality products for the customer segment out there. You can go to the next slide, Carolyn. Thank you. These are the farmers that supply Strauss Family Creamery with milk. I try to never go without a presentation without honoring them for all their hard work that they do in taking care of the land and helping provide nutrient-dense food for our community. Next slide. So cutting to the chase, at Strauss Family Creamery, in addition to having a missional purpose, we also have a very aggressive ethic as it relates to environmental sustainability. And most recently, this has played itself out with some very aggressive climate goals for our company and for the dairy industry in general. Our founder, Albert Strauss, has challenged me with his BHAG, which is to create a replicable carbon neutral dairy system at his own farm in the next few years. And that picture you're looking at right there is a picture of the pastures at his farm in Marshall, California. And for those of you who aren't aware, this is a very big deal. This is something that has not happened globally yet. I think most people are aware that the dairy industry is a somewhat significant contributor to climate impact. And therefore, as a result of those large impacts, we are seeking to prove that that doesn't necessarily need to be the case, and that with an economically beneficial and operationally low impact suite of solutions, we can flip the script on dairy being a climate intensive industry. Next slide. So for those of you who are questioning what I'm talking about and how that might be possible, I have a quick formula for you. When you add all these items up, this is, in a sense, how you can get to a carbon neutral dairy farm. Now, for the purpose of today's discussion, finance and sustainability, I'm going to focus on that one item in the formula in red, anaerobic methane digesters for manure management. This is a really key piece to the carbon neutral equation on an organic dairy farm. And therefore, it's a key piece as it relates to financing. And we want to dig into what that means practically. Next slide. So beyond just achieving carbon neutrality at our owner's dairy farm and proving that it's possible, we also have ambitious goals for the 12 family farms that supply our network with milk. And even beyond that, to create a model that many other dairy farms in our milk shed in Marin and Sonoma County, and perhaps even nationally or globally, feel like they can take these practices, adopt them, and follow a model fairly easily so that as a community of dairy farmers, we can pursue a common goal of low carbon dairy farming. Now, when you look at our next 15 years, we have one of these audacious goals. Next few years, carbon neutral at our owner's dairy farm. And then maybe in the next 15, hopefully less than that, net carbon neutral at these farms that supply us with milk. Now, you'll see there in the "Is it possible" slide that we need investment to make this happen. And this is really where innovative financial instruments can play a very big role in helping us achieve these somewhat ambitious goals. Next slide. And so that's the question of the day. How will we fund the gap from what today is 40,000 metric tons of GHG emissions per year in our dairy supply chain to net zero? And that's going to take a lot of interesting, innovative projects, but all those projects have big dollar signs attached to them. So how can we sustainably finance this initiative? I think with a pilot model, we could take funding from a private foundation that wants to see this happen, and that could be done, but how can we continue to do this such that all dairy farms can adopt this? And so as we are creating operational solutions, I'm also working to create financial solutions that pair with them. Next slide. And so that gets to my big point here, creating solid financing mechanisms. It's equally important as creating the operational, the project level solutions that may not exist yet. The two go hand in hand. You can't separate them. If you don't have good financing, if you don't have that available, especially for farmers who are not resource rich, then this just won't happen, and we won't be able to meet ambitious sustainability goals, especially ambitious and important climate goals. Next slide. So I like to show this slide because it really highlights the importance of methane emissions on a dairy farm. Methane emissions on an organic dairy farm represent around half of total emissions, and reducing them is the biggest challenge. By implementing a lot of carbon farming practices or regenerative farming practices that I'm sure many of you have read about in the past few years, you can significantly reduce land-based emissions through carbon sequestration and other methods. But dealing with methane, both from animals and from animals' manure, it's a bigger challenge. And at the bottom of this page, you see the two big solutions that Strauss Family Creamery is targeting to take a GHG intensive farming model into a low intensive dairy farming model. And those solutions are feed supplements like red seaweed that will reduce enteric emissions by up to 90%. And then today what we're discussing, micro methane biodigesters to reduce methane emissions from manure lagoons. Now let's dig into that. Next slide, please. So methane biodigesters is not a new technology, but building these systems for small scale organic dairy farmers, which I would posit is a more sustainable global solution for the dairy industry than large scale intensive animal operations. In order to make these systems exist and be financially viable, we need to create new technology. Most biodigester systems are geared for large industry or large dairy farms. And when you're looking at small dairy farms that might have 100 to 500 dairy cows, you're really looking at a complete different technology. And so we've gone out and we've co-developed a brand new technology. You're actually looking at the pilot system at the Strauss Dairy Farm that will allow for small dairy farms to eventually adopt this. but new tech requires new investment and revenue. So we did a very traditional thing to get this pilot off the ground. We received a grant from a local community foundation. But to make it last, to make adoption of these technologies work for the future for dairy farmers who only have manure supply to power their digester, we need better revenue opportunities. Traditional power purchase agreements to PG&E or other local energy authorities do not provide sufficient revenue to pay back such investments. And so we've gone out and we formed a partnership with BMW to transfer the electric production on the Strauss Dairy Farm to BMW electric vehicles in Northern California through the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard Program. Now, this is a really complicated program. I'm sure you all might have a lot of questions, but the basic gist is the state of California is incentivizing dairy farms to produce bioelectricity and transfer that electricity through renewable energy credits to electric vehicle drivers in California. But beyond that, to pay for the upfront cost of these systems, which is roughly $500,000 per unit, we need investment that farmers do not traditionally have. And so we're working on two creative financing solutions: pay-as-you-earn with an investor co-asset ownership model, or a pay-as-you-save super low interest revolving loan fund. And we're developing these financial instruments with partners while we're also developing this technology, so that as soon as we're ready to commercialize this technology, the financing will be there in a method that doesn't put farmers at risk, but also enables them to adopt the technology. Next slide. So to dig into our partnership with BMW, because this is a really creative opportunity, I just wanted to give you a few details as it relates to this type of program. So a farm can indeed partner with a major international automotive group for purposes of sustainability. It creates great marketing opportunities, but for the purpose of what I'm trying to accomplish, it creates some financial mechanisms that help adopt and invest in new technology. So whereas before a power purchase agreement might only supply 8 cents per kilowatt hour produced, through the Air Resources Board Low Carbon Fuel Standard Program, we can get anywhere from 20 to 60 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, for those bean counters out there, that's a big difference, and it can drive a new era of technology adoption. And so that's really a really important point, in addition to helping us achieve our goals of getting to a carbon neutral dairy network. Next slide, please. And so here's just a few details on the Low Carbon Fuel Standard Program. Again, we're taking advantage of a government-based program that was a result of California-based policy, AB 32, that finally has worked its way into a program that dairy farmers can now create renewable energy credits and sell them in a marketplace structured and run by the state of California. And here's a couple details for this. When you get the slides afterwards, you can see point 6 there. There's a link for everything else if you want to dig into this topic. It's a really great opportunity, and there's a lot of money being thrown into this credit market right now. Next slide. So I just wanted to end with a couple key ideas for those of you who are wondering, including my colleague who's on the phone right now, how you can support sustainability professionals in their big, crazy, ambitious projects that look on the surface like they may not have a chance to be long-term viable because there may be no financial structure behind them. So number one, provide project level financial review and support. Financial analysts and directors can really help set guideposts and go, no-go scenarios that will create efficiency throughout the organization. If sustainability professionals are known for anything historically, it's for running down a road with a big, great idea, only to find out later, months on, years later on, that they were running with a financially inviable project. It just was never going to work. And so grabbing the arm of a sustainability person from time to time and say, have you thought about XYZ, can really be helpful in creating organizational efficiency around some of these sustainability goals. The next point is open the door for conversations with existing banking partners. I think we've all seen and know that banks are increasingly open to finance sustainability projects, whether it's solar as maybe the most common identifiable option, or new opportunities like methane biodigesters. Finance folks can help us sustainability professionals walk through what it might look like to get traditional financing for some of these projects that might look new, they might be new, but really can be financed through traditional mechanisms. And then finally, help highlight risks. There's a lot of risk, especially when you're entering into non-traditional financing vehicles, especially the ones I mentioned earlier, where you're doing a co-asset investor pay-as-you-save type model. We want to be able to protect our investments. We want these investments to go well, and we want them to be successful such that we can lead to further adoption of such practices in the future. In order to get there, we need to make sure that we don't have major pitfalls and stories that come up where maybe farmers are taken advantage of, or financing that drops off the plate and leads to a lot of risk for a company. So highlighting those risks could be a very important provision that you can help your sustainability colleagues look at as they venture into these projects. And that's it for me. I hope you all enjoyed this presentation and came away with a few key ideas for how you can work with folks like me in your organization.
Thanks, Joseph. And thank you to Jamie and Bob Hirth. That was a wealth of information squeezed into about 40 minutes. A great job. Does anyone have any questions? I've got one or two, so I'll lead it to the audience first. Anyone?
Mark, I got one in the chat if you want me to read.
Please do.
So this is for a question for Jamie. Is your finance team able to show a measurable impact on the bottom line following the ESG initiatives you have implemented?
Yeah, I don't know if you can say who asked the question. Is it
and Andy K asked.
Yeah, I think we could. When I look at ROI, I would say it's really specific to the companies that I've worked for and the measurements that matter. So we could take a look at that from a customer standpoint, and we have data around that. How do our customers assess us when they're making buying decisions based on what they know about our environmental and social integrity? We could talk about that from, again, a banking covenant standpoint and debt standpoint. Those are probably the two that I would point to most readily. Certainly from a sustainability standpoint, there have been some initiatives that we've taken on that have reduced our cost basis. So we could point to a COGS standpoint from that. But I would say for the most part, what we're trying to do is measure the impact that we're having in sourcing communities around the world, because it's part of who we are. It's our identity. It's what we care about. And so our first round of ROI has really been in assessing the measurement of impact in that sense and with consumers. But over time, I think it's something that I'm being challenged by our board to look at, to say, how is this actually filtering through to the bottom line outside of course, the operational sustainability metrics that reduce our cost basis. I don't know if that was specific enough. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think the answer is it's very difficult to quantify. Yeah. So I mean, I worked at a company where we made 100% recyclable bottles, and so it's like 100% recycled PET bottles, and we saw a sales impact, positive sales impact, as soon as we did that launch and the communication, everything around it. So that was measurable. The non-measurable was when we became a B Corp. Clearly, it's intangible as well, and intangible effect in terms of the consumers were probably very happy and proud and whatever to be consuming products from a B Corp company, but there was no massive kind of increase suddenly in sales. So yeah, but it's clearly that it's something back of people's minds. That means that they're more likely to buy you than somebody maybe that isn't B Corp or isn't as good in their mind as you are. So.
Yeah, and it's tricky. I mean, there are also things like California regulations about human rights in your supply chain. So our certifications in some cases ward off any sort of fines associated with non-compliance with regulation, you know, those kinds of things. It's difficult to actually point to a line item on your books that would substantiate that, but we know that it does produce results as part of the whole. And again, it's consistent with our identity and employee pride and engagement and all of those things. It's tricky. I know a lot of times we end up relying both on kind of the industry data, and I had a slide to that, and also project specific data, but trying to find that interim data point is challenging.
I have a question. This is to the three of you. Fortunately, the three of you are zealots with regard to sustainability, and you made a very good comment, Jamie, about it starts at the top. Given your experience, when you are considered, it may not start from the top. It may have to start from the middle or start from the bottom. What have you found in your career that has provided you a good tool to get it to the top?
Hey, Mark, this is Bob. Since I work with public companies, one of the very interesting things is go find 2 or 3 of your competitors and look at their reports and bring those to the table. We had a client that we took their 2 biggest competitors. Those 2 competitors were way ahead of that organization in their reporting, their goals, you know, all the things that we're doing, and I'll just say their valuation. So, I mean, peer reporting, competitiveness is one way you can get it. You get the dialogue juiced up.
Good point. Good point. Thanks, Bob.
And also investors, I would say all of the pressure from CDP and others of publicly traded companies that I've worked for, I've seen that work. And customers, obviously seeing that some of your major customers are starting to put pressure on you to respond. I will say I have worked in companies before where I was leading corporate responsibility and philanthropy and wanted to begin a sustainability program that wasn't currently in existence. And I was explicitly told, no one here cares about that, but if you can do it in your free time, go ahead. And I told them, look, this train is coming and we have to lay the tracks before it arrives. And so I got permission to do that. And I think a lot of times, maybe I'm wrong, but I think we're creatures of comfort. We do what we know how to do. And so when an executive who's been in the industry for 35 years knows how to deliver solid financial performance, but doesn't know how to respond to all of these questions about climate change and whatnot, when you can build a path for them and say, okay, fine, I hear you, but I'm going to do it anyway, and present it to them, I found that generally people are open to hearing that, but it does just require some initiative because it's overcoming the fear of the unknown.
Good for you. Good. Well, it's 12:56. We always stop on time. Thank you, Bob, Jamie, and Joseph, in providing your insights. To everyone, as I said earlier when we began, this is being recorded. Bob, Jamie, and also Joseph provided resources that people can go to. The train is at the station in certain areas, left the station in others, and coming up to the station at others. So it's a journey, but we all know this imperative that the finance folks in the group, and Joseph, including the bean counters, that was a joke for you. That was a joke for you, Joseph. But anyway, well taken. And everyone, thank you for showing up today. And hopefully you found this session very worthwhile. Okay, thank you.